Hi, it's Matthew Holt. I am the founder, publisher, owner, and chief waller at the Healthcare blog. This is the January the 7th episode of THCB Gang. It's our first one of the new year. I've got a great lineup of my regulars today. We have we divided them up into based on whether or not they had a Y chromosome. Today I was kidding around with that. Who do we have? We have Rosemarie Day from Boston, Massachusetts, CEO of Day Health Strategies and author of Marching Towards Coverage. Kim Bellard, regular writer and THCB contributor, has a great couple of old year and new year pieces up on THCB. Robin Farmanfarmaian, speaker, author, patient, CEO, and currently, we may see in a minute, current patient. Deven McGraw, from now the wilds of Northern California, chief regulatory officer at Citizen. And then our two old men futurists, Jeff Goldsmith from Virginia Health Futures in Virginia, and Ian Morrison from Menlo Park. So let's go live now. Everyone will come on the screen, and really looking forward to the show today. So guys, the good news is since we were all last together just before Christmas, absolutely nothing has happened. Well, some stuff happened. Anybody have any thoughts about like yesterday's two big events? Who wants to start?
Well, I know that I was shooting straight sugar out of like plastic cups by the end of the night, watching it all go down. That's my drug, you know.
I thought it was a shame that what otherwise would have been an amazing thing in Georgia that we could have and would have been talking about for days got completely wiped off the front page, and now it's like an afterthought. I mean, obviously we should talk about what happened yesterday, but it pains me. That was just some incredible work done in Georgia to do what they did in terms of empowering people to vote, and it became yesterday's news just like that.
I mean, I was struck that on Monday, I think it was there was a threat that they were going to attack the Capitol, and people thought it was Iran in retribution for their general killed last year. It turns out we don't need Iran to attack our Capitol. Americans are doing that perfectly well themselves.
I mean, I thought we did a pretty credible imitation of a failed state yesterday.
I'll quote Dickens. Yeah. I think it was the best of times, and then it was the worst of times, and all in one day. That's awesome. But I think we're here to try and put the emphasis on going back to what was the best of yesterday and pushing that forward and not letting that fall by the wayside, because there's so much positive that can happen in the healthcare world based on those results.
Yeah. I agree with all of that. I mean, it looked to me like the Duck Dynasty insurgency. You know, I mean, I mean, is this the best he can come up with? And most of them, it turns out, are being identified as QAnon and assorted whack jobs. But there's serious questions about who knew in Homeland Security what was going down. Because if you follow this stuff on Twitter of some of the smart observers, that they knew exactly what was going down, and Trump knew exactly what was going down. So there's a lot to get to the bottom of. But I'm with you on the glass half full thing. I mean, John Lewis has got to be up in heaven thinking that his pastor and his protege are the new senators that will give control or take control away from Mitch McConnell. That's pretty special at one level. So we got to focus on that.
Yeah, except that Mitch McConnell came in really handy as an excuse for not doing anything. And now that Mitch is no longer the excuse for not doing anything, it's going to be the divisions inside the Democratic Party that result in our not doing anything.
Right.
So I think the idea that you've got the Democratic Party is clinging to power by a fingernail paring, and a 50-50 majority in the Senate for 2 years. Maybe is a curse as well as a blessing.
So let's dive in on all of that a little bit, because I think there are sort of three things that I'm thinking. One is that we've got who knows, we have 13 more days of Trump, or maybe not, depending on impeachment, 25th Amendment, whatever. And there's a lot of stuff that, needs to get done quickly. We haven't mentioned, by the way, the death rate and the hospitalization rate is now higher than it's ever been. Many other countries, not just the US, are going on essentially lockdown. Los Angeles is out of ICU beds. I mean, I don't know if Ian's got any reports from Martin Luther King, but
I can give you an update later, Matthew. But go on.
So we've got to figure out what happens now and then what happens next with the vaccine and whatever else. Secondly, I mean, how much time and effort is going to be spent by the Democrats figuring out what went wrong here, what's gone wrong? Is the sideshow around Trump with, God knows, New York State coming after him for who knows what, going to continue on, and what's that going to do to sort of the politics? And then the third part is how does, to get to Jeff's question, now officially with Kamala Harris, you've got the winning vote in the Senate, but you've only got a majority of, was it 9 in the House? And you've got a president who came on board not promising radical change, but some change. And you've written about this on THCB, Jeff, to the healthcare system. What's actually going to happen, over the next weeks and months, when the administration starts. So there's a lot to unpack in those three things, but all those three things are going to be going on at the same time. So who has a thought there?
Well, let me give you just the data point on MLK and Los Angeles as a perspective. We're a 130 bed community hospital. We have about 200 inpatients right now. You may have seen this story over Christmas. We have gurneys in the gift shop. We have people in tents and corridors. And about 158 of those patients are COVID positive and in for COVID. So theoretically, we're 120% of our capacity is COVID. And the numbers for LA, I just saw, I don't know if these are public, but they're certainly ones we've gotten from other hospitals. The Kaiser hospitals are at the 35 to 50% level. Cedars is low end of that range. At UCLA, the West Side, more affluent hospitals are slightly lower, but it's pretty bad everywhere. There's a slight diminution over the last few days, but not much. It's grim. And that story, it's getting to look a little bit like New York, but with a little better preparedness on the therapeutic side.
What do we think is a prospect for either having any changes in the way hospitals are dealing with this in the next few weeks, months? And then probably the other part is that we talked relatively optimistically about the vaccines, and they seem to have slowed down quite a bit and had some issues and problems there. So what's our sense? What's the group mind sense here about, is anything going to get better for the hospitals, or are we going to see this continue on as we still have the New Year's spike? The Europeans did manage to, reverse their spike a bit. Jeff?
Well, hospital census, COVID census has quadrupled in the last 90 days. It's quadrupled. And 1 in 6 patients in the whole hospital system are now COVID patients. So, I think the problem is, I think people are past the idea of mandating an interruption in elective care and all the rest of that. But I think the sheer numbers are going to result in an interruption anyway. And I think a lot of people, just as we've seen, the excess deaths, that it's, 25% more than the reported deaths from COVID are excess deaths. A lot of those deaths are from people sheltering at home with symptoms of stroke or COPD or untreated but diagnosed cancer. And I think we're going to see those numbers go up as well. So I think it's going to be people's concern about exposing themselves to COVID, or their concern about their condition not being as serious as the people that are in intensive care and not wanting to get in the way, that's going to take down hospital revenues and earnings. There's a lot of places in the country that aren't like Los Angeles. Virginia is not, 120% of capacity being COVID. But I think a lot of people are just very concerned about using the health system right now because we're in the middle of this pandemic. And the hospital is where you go when you have it.
What's kind of eerie is that, in some ways we are like we were a year ago, because this second strain is in the US, it's spreading. We don't know how fast it's spread or how far it's permeated. So we could be doing a whole nother wave of COVID like we were last year. And, it's going to catch us by surprise again, because we're not tracking it. We're not testing for it. We're not dealing with it proactively.
I mean, I've had 4 cases in my immediate family. My oldest son and his wife, my brother, my sister and brother-in-law have all had COVID. And I mean, it just feels like it's kind of all around us. It is all around us.
It is, but we're in the percentages, right? We're in the 15, 20, 25%. We were, well below 10 at one point in terms of in the community, but we still have 70, 80% of the community of the population who haven't had it, or at least haven't been tested for it. And it seems to me that there was this race about how quickly could we get the vaccines done, and that seems to have been, that process seems to have stopped and collapsed. I mean, there's or not collapsed, but certainly been really badly hit, and then there's some confusion about whether we should go with 1 vaccine dose or 2, and what they're doing in the UK versus what they're doing here, and I mean, again, this is an area where we were kind of optimistic that if we could just hang on with the hospitals through January, March, February, March, we'd be okay. But it now seems that process to get everyone fully vaccinated may take a lot longer. I mean, is there more stuff we should be doing?
Well, 3 small data points on the vaccine. We're already seeing stories about rich people getting it ahead of other people. We're seeing stories in nursing homes giving it to their donors instead of to their patients. And we're seeing, I just heard the governor talk about in one local county, the EMS people got in line ahead of the healthcare workers, and the health department let them do that. So, because of these shortages, people are breaking the lines in whatever creative ways they can. So whatever little plans there were about how it's distributed, they're all ready to not.
But ultimately, we need to vaccinate everybody. So on some level, the fact that EMTs butted in front of their line, they got vaccinated. The donors shouldn't have gotten ahead of other people, but they got vaccinated. Like at some point, we just should be massively just pushing it out and stop worrying about whether we're queuing people
massively
in the right
is the
order.
question. When we're capable of doing it massively, I would agree. But right now, we are way far away from being able to do it.
But that's where the new administration is going to take much more of a strong-arm federal approach. Do the Defense Production Act, like all the logistics and supply chain issues that can be more centrally controlled. I think they're going to take ownership of immediately. They're already making plans, and that will, and the goal is 24/7 vaccinations. So I think, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be way better. It's not just let the states do whatever, and leaving them stranded, frankly. So, and I guess the good news is from the hospital side, I mean, it is going to be awful, but at least the frontline workers are getting vaccinated. And that is like a sea change in terms of what it means for their morale, the risk they're taking, all that. So, there's still a risk of burnout, but the horror show of what it's been all of 2020 is going to diminish just from the standpoint of the healthcare workers themselves being protected. And that's huge.
A question, maybe Ian, you can answer. So I've seen several reports of nursing home workers where 56% of the workers are not getting vaccinated. Is that happening in the hospitals too, or is that just a nursing home phenomenon?
Well, I mean, most hospitals are prioritizing access. Stanford, for example, ran into it because they had this sophisticated algorithm which left out residents, which is preposterous, right?
Which left out half the important data.
I was teasing them that it was a good example of acute algorithmia. But anyway, so there's a prioritization going on. I mean, funnily enough, on this topic, I just was master of ceremonies this morning for a group with Vizient where we had Gottlieb, Slavitt, Orzag, and Mark McClellan on, talking about these issues. And I think we've all identified the issue, right? Which is that the cold chain from the manufacturer to either health systems or public health departments is working okay. It's the last mile that's the problem. And to Rosemarie's point, there was no plan, right? And so there is a tension between, although these guys agree on just about everything, but the Gottliebs of the world would say we got to invoke CVS and whatever. And his view is anybody who wants it should get it, because he worries about all the people who don't want to get it. And on the other hand, I think Slavitt and folks who are closer to the Biden administration's point of view would be, let's have a national plan and invoke big time players to make it happen. But I think everybody agrees that's the priority. We've got to get this stuff, as many people vaccinated as fast as possible.
So, I mean, there are two things that I've noticed that didn't happen, right? There appears to be a lot of people who could be doing vaccines. I don't know how much training you require to like jab someone in some arm. I don't know if this is the unemployed, waiters could be turned into techs, or that's overly optimistic. But nonetheless, we need to have a staff of people who are involved in doing this. And this is kind of like doing the census every year or whatever, getting through people very quickly. The other thing I've heard from, I had an amusing story with a guy now who was doing PPE recruitment or PPE scavenging basically for a big New York hospital early in the pandemic. He told me a rather amusing story about New York State being defrauded by some shysters in Hong Kong who took a lot of their money and didn't actually supply the PPE and distribute on the face of the earth. But the other thing he told me, which is that we are seriously in problems in the supply chain for needles and syringes, which I haven't heard from anyone else. But I mean, it's not just the vaccine and making the vaccine and getting the vaccine out, but it's also the other stuff you need to go around it. And I don't know if that's going to, we don't seem to have the physical capacity to go 24/7 and get everyone done, that we might like. But we also have this issue with, do we actually have the supplies we need? And I think that, we never got the Defense Production Act, or whatever it is, invoked early in the Trump administration. I can't see them not doing that, because it just is the only real thing that matters, as well I can tell.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think that they're going to invoke that right away. And within about a month after January 20th, we're going to be looking at a different United States and getting these high risk people in the nursing homes. CVS is the one who's taking care of that. And I trust CVS to be able to do the logistics of being able to vaccinate our elderly very quickly. So I don't know, everything looks golden to me. I'm looking out a month and I'm like, yes.
For so many reasons, right? Another month.
Boy, you guys, honestly, I'm not as rosy as y'all are.
I agree.
74 million people voted for Donald Trump. They're not going anywhere on January 21st. And I think when you look at the polling data, you're going to be stunned at the number of those folks that thought that what happened yesterday was actually an appropriate manifestation of outrage, that his election had been stolen. Right. I think our country is deeply divided. It is crippled right now.
Oh, Jeff, did you hear their new defense of what happened yesterday? It wasn't them. It was Antifa.
Antifa. Yeah. No, I heard that. But I mean, I guess my point is, even if the Biden administration has a plan and executes it, and I think the answer is yes, they will have a plan, and B, they will put 90% of their energy and political chips into executing it. We've really got a problem here. Our public health system is in a state of collapse. I think that's a correct way to put it. It isn't just the hospitals. It's all of the supporting cast. It's all of the folks that should have been doing testing, should have been doing contact tracing. This could happen again. And the thing that really worries me more than anything else is we've given people a full-on look at how vulnerable our society is. We can't defend ourselves against, civil disorder. We can't defend ourselves against pathogens. We are
cyber attacks right now. And cyber attacks. We've discovered that we've been under a cyber attack this whole time too, and didn't defend ourselves against that.
And it was China's fault.
Yeah.
or Russia or somebody, or we did it to ourselves.
Or somebody, one of those people.
Well, okay. So I don't want to get totally depressed because it's very easy to, but I do think that when we look at the work that somebody like Stacey Abrams did in Georgia with her organization Fair Fight, and what you could cut and paste that to some other states to re-enfranchise people who've been shut out and frankly lost hope that it made any difference to vote or to do something. That's a pretty profound change when you look at that. Similarly, the work to do the anti-gerrymandering stuff that Eric Holder's doing is also vitally important, because this has got to be, I think, a realignment of how our more grassroots politics are happening in order to, in my view, drive the kind of change we need to see at the federal level. I mean, Trump did not win. He did not win by that much. It was, back in 2016. Right? I mean, he did. He didn't. And so yes, 74 million people voted for him, but I do think there could be a much more humane Republican Party. And they're going to have their internecine fights. I don't know, that's also going to be happening. But I do think some incredible work, and it is a long game. It is not like the silver bullet kind of thing, but you look at making that kind of investment, and I think more people are woke up to the fact that that's what's needed on the Democratic side.
The largest political party in the United States, 40% of voting age Americans are members of the Are You Kidding Me party. Neither of these parties is capable of governing our country. They are both incredibly divided. They have terrible leadership issues. I mean, I'm delighted at what happened in Georgia. I'm delighted that the Democrats have at least nominal control of Congress. But we have a geriatric leadership in that party and profound divisions on what that party ought to do. So the idea that you win elections, that just puts you in a position of actually having to do something. And it's the doing something part that, to me, is a real problem.
Can we, sorry, Kim, and then I have a question moving on. But Kim?
I mean, Stacey Abrams gets all the credit she should for what happened in Georgia, but look how long it took, how much money it took, and look back at November. If you exclude Georgia and Biden, the Republicans cleaned up, and that their game is in place. Their long game has been playing for a long time now. So as Jeff said, that's 74 million people. They're voting for other candidates too, and they are winning.
Well, and if you take out New York and California, Trump won the country. He won the rest of the country. Yeah. The Democrats should have swept this election. They didn't get a single legislative house, not one, which means they're going to control the redistricting that's going to take place in the wake of the 2020 census. And I don't know, I'm a political junkie. Let me finish. Being a political junkie, I read the polls. There's a brilliant pollster for Real Clear Politics named Sean Trend, who went through and looked at all of the legislative changes, the changes in gubernatorial seats in congressional seats that are going to take place as a result of the election. California is actually going to lose a seat, shocking but true, in that process. The Republicans are going to be able to control the House of Representatives, all of the things being equal, just through the redistricting process. So, I mean, replicate Stacey Abrams times 10. You've still got a tremendous headwind in the direction of a governing coalition of people that actually want constructive change in our society.
And this was in the midst of the worst pandemic in 100 years and the worst economic thing in 70 years, and yet Trump only barely lost. Can you imagine what happened if either one of those had not been true?
Right. Well, I mean, I want to build on Jeff's basic point about the difficulties of governing a divided country. So I took a look, I'm not a political scientist, but I'm a geography major, at the votes by county for Ossoff and Sunny
Warnock.
No, just the Ossoff race.
Purdue.
Ossoff and
Okay, I mean, I didn't look at the Warnock.
David.
They were very similar, right? And if you went down county by county, I counted 13 counties where there was less than a 10% differential in margin, right? So there's 159 counties, God knows why, in Georgia. Only 13 of them had a less than 10% margin. So what we've done, not only are we divided, but we are isolated from one another, right? You look at the margin in the red counties and it was 20, 30% for Purdue. You look in the blue, it was 20, 40, 50% for Ossoff. That is the basic problem. You've got the Duck, Dynasty crowd who just do not hang out with people in cities and have a very different perspective. I mean, this is a deep. So one of the things I asked these guys today was, I mean, they are models of bipartisanship. They've been doing a lot of work together, whether it be Gottlieb or McClellan or Slavitt. How do we make that more normal in our rather than one team wins and they get everything they want and the other team wins versus they get everything they want? That's, to me, the fundamental problem this country's got to solve, because it is divided, and it's not going to be fixed just by, you know, a up in turnout to the point where Democrats have quote unquote permanent control, because that disenfranchises a big chunk of folk.
Well, so let's. Those are really big issues, and they're going to have, you know, big implications. And the state of play. And if you go back to what did Joe Biden say this morning or yesterday, we have 3 co-equal branches of government. You know, we've now had the judiciary, which has been heavily influenced over the last. Well, I mean, we have a Supreme Court that doesn't look like the rest of the electorate. We have a judiciary which doesn't look like that. We obviously have Congress, which, as Jess said, is gerrymandered and going back and forth. We have the presidency, which has to go through the electoral college. So even what a not very close election, even though there was big turnout, a lot more votes for Trump than there were in 2016, a lot more votes than there were for Romney in 2012. Nonetheless, you know, we have to go through the electoral college, and you end up with Rudy Giuliani in front of a. Devin, you have your background again of the the Four Seasons landscaping, right? You have all the craziness that you had over the last.
This is my house. This is not Four Seasons.
No, I know it wasn't. You came in it last time. I'm not.
Oh yes. I can put that back up if you want.
But I'm reminding you. But I mean, the reason we had that is any other rational country, or you have how many votes were there? Well, there were 80-some million for one and 74 for the other, and then you would say, well, you're done. You'd have to go through the palaver, which ended up in yesterday, right, where you had to certify it in the House, and you have all these senators standing up and saying they don't believe it for whatever reason. But nonetheless, you know, we're going to go through what we're going to go through in that, and nothing is going to change for a long time. So now we've got 2 years where, for the next 2 years, whether they're a divided party between the AOCs and the Nancy Pelosi's or not, we've got, you know, Kamala Harris to do the deciding vote. What do we think is actually going to happen when, you know, forget the vaccine, but when, you know, obviously the vaccine stuff from the administration, but in terms of legislation to, you know, recalibrate the ACA or what do we think is going to happen over the next few months that we couldn't have had happen if McConnell was still running the Senate? Rosemarie, dig in.
I mean, first off is just to get rid of the case before the Supreme Court, to save the ACA by reinstituting some nominal dollar amount for an individual mandate. And that just negates that entire lawsuit situation. And so that's still playing defense.
Does that work?
Yeah.
By the way, dumb question. Does that, if you change the law after the law that was, you know, they're complaining about a law that's currently was passed, if you then change the law again, does that work?
Yeah, the challenge is moot because the situation doesn't exist anymore.
I'm glad we heard our lawyer for the day.
Can you filibuster the change in the law?
But
you could probably do it through reconciliation. This is one of those things that could be done with the 50 votes.
Boy,
wasn't it done through reconciliation in the first place?
So
The Times had an article this morning that walked through what you can do with and without reconciliation, what the things that they might do in healthcare, which was, I urge you to read that to get some idea of the steps you could take.
I don't know. I can say, I think the biggest constraint on Biden and on the Democrats is going to be the enormous budget deficit that they inherit. Yeah. And the fact that there probably is going to need to be further economic stimulus or something remotely like that will add to the base fiscal 21 deficit of what? $2.7 trillion? That's the base.
But aren't we looking, if we're talking about, we got 900 billion just before Christmas, and then we're going to add, you know, more payments to that. Aren't we talking about doing another 3 trillion anyway? Doesn't in some ways that give us an opportunity to do more stuff? I mean, who on the Democratic Party is going to be opposed to that?
There's going to be a free-for-all for that additional money, and the ability of a weak majority to manage that free-for-all. There's a tremendous demand for more on the part of all of these constituencies, that each one of them has a very persuasive individual case for getting funded. My personal belief, I think the chances for a meaningful coverage expansion out of this administration have gone from 0% before Tuesday to 5% after Tuesday.
Wow.
From 0 to 5.
That's
No, I agree. They're clearly at zero.
A
I want-
5,000% increase from 0.
Well, you know, Orzag would
zero is
agree with
zero.
you. He stepped through it, that the likelihood of getting a major expansion at the federal level is, I mean, I think we all know the levers. I mean, they'll reverse executive orders, and they'll fund, navigators and promotion again of exchanges and that stuff. And they can use waiver authority at the states if somebody wants to join the Medicaid party. But that's the ones who are left are ideologically opposed. I mean, the states with people in them like Florida, Texas, and
States
Georgia.
with people in them. One thing, of course, we always talk about sort of the bigger picture goals of healthcare reform, which absolutely need congressional input, but there's a lot that Biden can do within the first 3 months, that administration, in terms of reversing some very bad decisions that were made either through executive order or regulatorily. And so one example would be the repeal of the 1557 regulations under the ACA, which were the ones that guaranteed non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. You know, what HHS did to those regulations is absolutely criminal. And the Biden administration, now those regs were changed in regs, so they have to go through the regulatory process to undo them, but they can start that on day one without Congress's, I mean, whatever's happening in Congress will happen in the background.
And you've got some Medicaid waivers
fair to
around
say
work
that on your
requirements.
list?
Sorry, I was going just to say you've got some Medicaid requirements for Georgia, for example, had like a change to the exchanges and some work requirements in Medicaid, and you've got a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, you turn those waivers down.
They can return that. But I mean, what about actual Medicaid expansion? I mean, there's no way it can be forced on Florida or Texas, right?
The states have multi-hundred billion-dollar deficits to deal with, and unlike the federal government, can't print money, can't buy their own debt. So the fiscal capacity to do the state part of coverage expansion is zero. So unless the federal government is willing to kick in, as they did at the beginning of ACA, 100% of the cost, where's that money going to come from? You're not going to see a lot of states rushing into it.
But that would be smart stimulus. That would be smart stimulus to really infuse the Medicaid program, particularly because of the pandemic. I mean, that's something they really ought to do.
But even if you agree with Rosemarie, that smart stimulus, Jeff, can they actually force Medicaid, Florida, and Texas?
No, they can't. No, they can't force them. But
two Republican governors there who are going to say no. You know that
they're going to have 5 million more Medicaid enrollees, regardless of what they do, because of what's going on with the economy. So to expand it beyond that, lots of luck. I think they're going to struggle to deal with the very large number of people that have lost private insurance coverage that really need it. We need to get those people covered. So, the idea,
and that's what the exchanges are for. And so they're exactly there for that. They should pump up some of the subsidies. This is where the money should be spent, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, when you're in a pandemic, you should be spending money on healthcare. First, we've got to get through vaccines and stuff. But this is where the money should go.
Well, wait a minute. But where? Give it to doctors and hospitals, or give it to home care workers? Give it to daycare workers? Expand daycare? I mean, that's the problem. Is there's a whole bunch of unmet needs, and where is the leverage? Where is the highest leverage place to put that additional money? It's not bloody obvious that expanding Medicaid is where that money ought to go.
I would. Technically, you're right, but I mean, if you go back to the issue of expanding Medicaid, right? The reason it was done that way in ACA, it was to get people up to what it was 130% of poverty. I forget the numbers. Was because that group is traditionally the working poor, but not mums and kids, were the ones who were left out. And there's as you've just said, Jeff, a whole bunch of people have joined their ranks because of the economic impact of the pandemic. But we're not at a point, so I think that could be covered anyway. Doesn't abrogate the fact that things like what we've discovered now, low pay for home care workers, appalling conditions in nursing homes, risks taken by, a bunch of other stuff that's going on in terms of risks taken by low paid hospital workers, et cetera, not to mention adjacent areas, as you mentioned, like daycare, other housing and poverty. So it's all happening at once. And yes, we could do a lot. The question I come down to is, are we at a point where no one cares about deficits, no one cares about fiscal responsibility, and the feds can print money to solve this in most places? And is there any appetite to do that? I think, Jeff, you're saying no, and Rosemarie is saying yes, which probably exemplifies the split in the Democratic Party, right?
I mean,
so let me just say one more thing.
Rosemarie, then Jeff.
All right. So we've been talking about classic Medicaid expansion as it was defined in the ACA, but there's like a wonky, nuanced thing here where you could, for the states that are just not going to expand Medicaid, there's these people in the gap, and you could expand the exchange subsidies. This would take legislation, but it could probably be done through reconciliation, so only 50 votes, and give people, it's not Medicaid coverage, but it would be a hell of a lot better than nothing. And these are the home care workers. These are the people who are on the front lines and have these jobs, but don't have health insurance. And Texas and Florida have left them out. And you could do some creative finagling there with the ACA subsidies to pick up those folks. It wouldn't be my first choice. I wish we could just expand Medicaid, but you can't make the states do it.
Right. Just rhetorically, Rosemarie, and I think that's a very good point. Think about the bang for the buck associated with doubling the capacity of community health centers to deal with all those folks. That's a $6 billion item to double the capacity of our community health centers. That's an alternative competing use of the non-existent money. What about the fact that 5 million women have been pushed out of the labor market because their schools are closed and because there's no daycare. The daycare programs in the country have collapsed. Is filling that gap and getting women back to work and getting the tax revenue and the fact that they can feed their families a better use of a limited amount of dollars than expanding the Medicaid program. That's the type of stuff I'm talking about. Those are hard calls, and I don't know how the new administration is going to make those calls. There's a lot of ways we could help.
Those are years long of debate. I mean, I think the question that Matthew's asking is, what can we do in the short term? And I completely agree with you, Jeff. And you can get into baby bonds and reparations, all that kind of stuff as well. But that's not going to happen in the first year of a Biden administration. Whereas you can and probably should make changes to ACA that can happen, quickly.
Yeah, but I think what we're saying is there are tough prioritization calls given the appetite for another 4 trillion, because you add up all these competing claims and you get a very big number.
Yep.
That's my question, just all. If we can do 3 trillion once and 3 trillion again, and we're still in the big hole, isn't it easier to do it more now? I mean, if at some point we ever get back to normalcy, if we're back in the 90s or back in the, do you don't remember that Clinton ran a budget surplus? Did we remember that? But if we get back to normalcy where we're arguing about whether we should have a balanced budget or not, we're now arguing between 2 and 3 and 4 trillion. And there is a good case to be made, as with the vaccines, that you got to spend it now because the whole, we didn't spend enough in 2009 and we stayed in the hole for 10 and 11. And look at Europe, where they didn't spend anything and they stayed in the hole. They never got out of the hole. That you could argue we should be spending that now. And by the way, fix a bunch of the structural stuff that we've got, which includes, daycare and this and hospitals and Medicaid and what have you. You can make that argument. I just want to know does anyone think there's 50 solid votes, including the senator from West Virginia, to do that?
No frickin' way. It's flat out not going to happen. There's a whole bunch of Democrats that are in Republican places that are not going to sign on to a New Deal 2.0 fiscal program. They're just not going to.
So let me have one line with you about that, Jeff. So I want to talk about the Hispanic areas of Texas that voted Republican. What, as far as I can understand, and I'm watching this TV, there was those Hispanic areas, those areas where there were more Hispanic votes for Republicans than Trump expected, was because they got a check with Donald Trump's name on it. And they were basically, those people were voting for public works. I think that this is a time where if we head back to the FDR New Deal type stuff, if you make this very plain, this is a munificence of the federal government coming to you, that actually might move some of that around. I don't know if that's going to change the mind of those moderate blue dog Democrats, but you could start moving some stuff around, because the old world in which Republicans have, if it was ever true, Republicans had fiscal responsibility and cared about this stuff, and the Democrats didn't. To me, that's all gone away. The Republican Party is now a rural white supremacist party, basically. With some, you can argue some exceptions, and the Democrats are this urban, weird coalition between college-educated liberals like us lot and and minorities. And you could argue that things have changed.
Let's not forget about extremely wealthy Republicans who want to keep corporate tax breaks and wealth, at bay, all that.
And they're massively powerful, but they're not a big voting phalanx.
and liberal Democrats that want their state and local tax deduction back. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff here that's really hard to stomach when you think about it.
Yeah, I agree. It's taken away. I mean, so to summarize, I love to get it. We have about 15 minutes left, so I love to summarize. Just to summarize where we are here. Okay, so we think that revolution and rioting is done. We hope. Maybe we don't. We're concerned. We're concerned about the split in the country. We think that there is appetite to do something in terms of fixing the ACA, fixing Medicaid, fixing some of the other stuff. Jeff doesn't believe there's anything much going to happen in terms of expansion coverage. Rosemarie is hopeful there is. I think there might be, because I think of the stress, but it would be much more likely if we had a Sanders presidency than a Biden presidency. But we at least have the capacity to do some of that stuff because of what happened in Georgia. Is that fair summary?
Yeah, and the point being that the economic malaise will have Medicaid grow no matter what,
right?
Just simply because more people will be poor and be eligible, and the other thing is that we will stop the erosion of coverage that occurred in the Trump years,
right?
Through deliberate kind of sabotage and underfunding of programs.
But to remember Jeff's point, we have 2 years of this, right?
Right.
Because.
Right.
Soon.
And I guess where I'm coming from is that I don't want to just sit back and make observations about what other people are going to have happen. I mean, I wrote a book that was a call to action to not let that be the case, to keep pushing and to get to people in the middle. A lot of the folks who are neither party, they may lean one way or the other, they're not registered, and to make the case that this country can do better. And I think Biden can appeal to a lot of those folks, but it comes from grassroots pressure. It's hard to do, but that's where I put my stake in the ground, as opposed to I'm going to sit and observe and commentate on it.
I mean, to me, the strategic problem is if the Democrats can't do stuff that makes working class Americans, black or white, say, I'm in a better place now than I was 2 years ago, they're going to lose Congress in 2022. They're going to lose it. So I think it really does require both messaging discipline and making choices, because they're not going to be able to spend 4 or 5 trillion more deficit dollars. It's just not going to flat out happen. They're going to need to make choices that affect the lives of working people that could be working or that want to work, that when they do it, makes a difference in their lives. And I think if they can have the discipline to do that, we're going to have the platform to do some of the stuff that Rosemarie is talking about.
Everyone that's on this call is probably old enough to recognize what a strange thing it is that the Republican Party is now the party of the working people.
Right. That's scary.
Right.
Well, some working people.
That's scary.
Yeah. It's kind of bizarre because they're not actually putting forward policies that help the working people, those who don't have the benefits they should have, through, et cetera. So that's where some messaging really needs to change.
But to Jeff's point,
no,
there's nobody in the Democratic Party that's leading that kind of messaging. I mean, there's nobody young. There's nobody that's got a vision that's really out there, and that's a real. I mean. There's look, there is. That's actually not true, because you've got the squad in AOC. It's just not a big chunk. It's a sizable one, and the Bernie Sanders wing. They're costing their party as many probably more votes than they're getting.
I agree.
You can argue back and forth. There is clearly a faction that doesn't agree with the Pelosi Biden mainstream, right? That is clearly that wants to spend the $5 trillion and do really big things. I understand they're not a majority of the Democratic Party, but they you know, and they're buying single payer and Green New Deal and all the rest of it. But you know what you're saying is that hasn't captured the imagination of the folks we saw rampaging around the Congress, the Capitol yesterday, right? The problem is, those people, in my view, who go back to the politics of this, they have wandered off from being economically driven. I mean, there may have been, you could argue about economic backdrop and what have you, but that's not an economic decision that I want to, you know, that I'm concerned about. The stuff that whatever they're concerned about is not traditional. We're still back, you know, a lot of us here are still sitting here back in the old, you know, working class, poor people, rich people dichotomy. That's not that. That's a very different thing. And that is a huge proportion of the Republican Party, right? Especially of that working class, non-college educated, you know, white rural Republican group that Ian was talking about.
Remember that a big chunk of the Democrats losing the quote working man close quotes was the collapse of the labor union movement. Collapse.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
And making it easier for people to unionize, including nurses and doctors and all the rest of it, doesn't cost you dollars. It's hard to do with a 50-50 majority in the Senate, but it's certainly easier to do now than it was 3 days ago. So, you know, the idea that you can change the labor laws, the idea that you can appoint an NLRB that is friendly to union organizing, which is clearly something they're going to be able to do with that majority. That's stuff that doesn't cost you money, but that is real compared to starting a trade war with China, or, you know, building a wall to prevent those nasty illegals from coming in. So there actually are things that they can do that don't involve the deficit that, you know, I think substantively would make a much bigger difference to the lives of working Americans than what Trump purported to do.
Yeah, Robin, you were trying to get in here.
I think what we're talking.
Hang on, Ian. Robin was trying to get in before.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, thinking about the fact that a lot of these working class Republicans are working class Republicans because of the social issues. They may or may not even understand that fiscally it hurts them to be Republican, but they are so on board with the social issues of immigration and discrimination. I mean, it's probably one of the main reason I turned into a liberal Democrat is because I am socially a liberal Democrat and I believe in immigration and equality and all of that kind of thing. And so the messaging needs to be something around that, because people really choose sides based on their social belief system.
Ian.
Well, I agree with that. And my thought was just in listening to this, that there are these bigger, longer term, more difficult themes about inequity and inequality and the way a post-industrial economy works or doesn't work for normal working folk. That's a big, longer term thing stacked up against the immediacy. I mean, I hadn't really focused on this. The 900 billion that we got just before the holidays, Orzag was saying that the prohibition on eviction just lasts till the end of January, for God's sake.
That's all they get.
And, you know, I mean, so we have crisis for many middle class and working class people in 60 days that have got to be resolved, right? Yeah. So I think that's where this, on the one hand, and God bless you, Rosemarie, for building a case, I'm with you, but on the other, there's this immediacy of the pandemic, the rollout, the emergency, hurry up offense to try and get this thing under control, that is going to swamp, I think, the agenda for the first, 60 days or so.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing we haven't mentioned, by the way, is that this is all going on, and then go back to something we don't have Jessica Master on today, so I'll play Jessica, not as good looking or as peppy, but the stock market is at an all-time high, and we are getting funding just this week, not even last year. This week we have had a bunch of deals in the health tech sector. United went out and bought Change Healthcare, which is a pretty meaty $13 billion deal. A company some of you may have never heard of called Hinge Health, which is a sort of musculoskeletal, management company, just raised $300 million at a $3 billion valuation. So you're seeing, a huge amount of this capital that's that was sitting on the sidelines is continuing to get deployed in the area, assuming that things are going to stay things are going to stay the same, and we're going to have aggressive employers, coming out and wanting to hire them. I mean, and this is the direct follow-on from the successes that Livongo and Teladoc and those guys had last year. And by the way, for reasons I don't quite understand, Teladoc stock went up 10% just this morning. So some of the world that we live in, we're talking about the doom and gloom and the crisis. We still have this massive imbalance between, what's going on in the financial markets and what's going on in the real world.
Here's one of the most shocking things about yesterday. The stock market went up while the Capitol was currently occupied.
Right.
And by the way, Elon Musk is now the world's richest man.
It also went up when Congress went home without enacting any stimulus. The common denominator seems to be, it doesn't matter what happens, the stock market goes up. What does that tell you? We are flooding the market with liquidity, and there's no other place to put the money.
That's it. Yeah, interest rates are zero and will be forever.
Right. We have the 10-year bond at 1%. 1%.
My company will take some.
Your company's done okay so far. I'm surprised you're not back. I'm not surprised you're not back in the well, but because that's actually minor diversion. Is for I love your comments on this for like 2 minutes. If you've got a United Health Group, which is throwing off whatever it is now $20 billion a year in pure profit, and there's almost unlimited money to move the market or to move the health market around, and then coming in and buying Change and buying whatever, and they bought a mental health company. They're obviously realigning what they are providing to the market. If you're a company that's I forget Deven how much Citizens raised, but it's in the 20 million, not 20, 30 million range, not the 200 million range yet.
Yeah, no, it's
I can tell that because otherwise you would have you'd have the real Four Seasons backdrop, not the fake. I'm kidding. But do we think that there is enough going on in terms of these big funding amounts, the 300 million here, the 500 million there that you're seeing for these new tech companies, enough to move around the incumbents? I mean, I'm always interested in if there is anything going on there, or are we just going to, even for the Uniteds, but when you talk about the incumbents with their, as we've discussed on the show many times, the incumbents with their huge reserves, the Northwells and the Sudders and the HCAs, do we think this is making a dent in it? And is any of the stuff we've talked about going to in terms of the crisis, the expansion of Medicaid, going to change any of that, or is that just popping along because there's so much money around?
Well, all this stuff is interconnected. Like, we didn't even have any time to talk about Haven, which another big thing that happened. We couldn't cover it. It was a big nothing burger. And why was it a big nothing burger? Because I think we've always been looking for employers to really start muscling the system into a better place, at least in terms of costs, if not quality, much less access. But some of them are hurting. Their costs are going up. All this stuff is definitely interconnected in terms of the pressures on the system that we have, which continue to sort of create this kind of crumbling effect. But it does make me wonder whether some of these economic pressures maybe will start pushing employers to do more. Haven probably didn't work because it was 3 big companies who couldn't come together and do things collectively. But I think there's still so much potential, and are the catalysts in place to sort of force some more aggressive action on their part, which has been absent, as far as I can tell.
Well, I would just say Haven went to heaven. Some of us, I'm not surprised, but you nailed it. I mean, they have a collective action problem. But that doesn't mean that Amazon isn't licking its chops at 20% of GNP. I think that's the residual takeaway from this, is somebody will carry that intellectual water. And Amazon's not doing it with the power of their purchasing power. They're doing it with the power of their business model.
Right.
And
Amazon's desire to make money in healthcare outweighs their desire to save money in employee benefits.
Well, Amazon's quite good at saving money in employee benefits. Actually, I'm being harsh, but they have put minimum wages up and what have you around the country. But haven't been overspending a lot on their employees, their healthcare, and I agree. I think Amazon looked at that and went, there was some interesting stuff. They liked the idea of the multiple competing parts of the company. It's Jeff Bezos' philosophy, and they decided that what Gowande started was quite interesting, and they replicated it. And I think they're going to make a major entry into healthcare this year because they've got this deal with Crossover, who will be by the board or captured by them. They've got the pill pack stuff. They've got Amazon Cares. They have the pieces to put together on why not start selling to other people. Having said all that, we're a way away from the big incumbents going away. I would have done this if we hadn't had the reactive start we had. If I'd gone around and asked everyone what they noticed this week, I did notice that I found out now how you stop being sued by Northwell for not paying your bill, which is you get an article on the front page of the New York Times about it. And Northwell was suing, I think, 1,000 people for like $2,000 each. And after the New York Times article, they started not to sue them anymore. And I figured out that the total owed but to Northwell was like $3 million. And the total paid to their CEO last year was $4 million. So it's not a big number for those guys. But nonetheless, you have these incumbents who are still. We don't have Raj Agrawal on this week since he's now left one of the big incumbents. But you still have these big incumbents around who are. It's going to be tough for either an employer or for a new startup, whether it's a startup, even the startup's called Amazon, to come in and shift them around. And we know that's going to be the case. I'm just wondering if there is, with the changes that we're sensing in the politics, which depending who you are on this call, you may think it greater or lesser, whether it's a time for a big shift in the way that healthcare is delivered, or whether all this money that's been put in the digital health sector, and you'll see an article from Jeff on this on THCB in the coming days, has got some impact, but not that much.
Well, that wasn't the argument. I mean, the argument was that if digital health is really going to pay off as a business, the care system is going to have to figure out how to leverage and use the tools. And if it doesn't, we're going to have a repetition of what we had with the electronic health.
Absolutely. But if the tool
spent a negative ROI, that was the point in the article.
And the article said, but if the tools get used, right, the question is who uses them. My guess is if you have the incumbents use them, they're less likely to use them successfully. Whereas if you have new organizations, whether it's Deven's or Amazon or whomever, and they can grow their market share, which they don't have now, then they'll have a better chance at really leveraging them. But you can argue that both ways. But somebody's got. You're correct. If you don't use them, you have to figure out how to scale people, which is the main resource. The way we inefficiently use them in healthcare, then none of this stuff matters. But we'll stay at 20% of GDP.
But Matthew, just one point, and Jeff and I go back and forward on this, but you could argue about the benefits of morality and appropriateness of scale. But I got to tell you, I've been talking to a bunch of these CEOs as part of this preparatory work I'm doing as master of ceremonies for a meeting, and they have become more important, not less important, through this pandemic. The incumbent large health systems have been the ones who are carrying the burden of even this vaccination rollout going forward, and they've been de facto public health, and are enjoying quote unquote a sort of resurgence in support from the community. So I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. The real question, and Jeff's upcoming piece I think is masterful in this, is saying we got to find a way to incorporate the new digital stuff into the existing game, which I've completely agree with, because this is not about them going away. They're not going away. The question is harnessing them and modernizing them to actually deliver more services at lower cost per unit, without necessarily disrupting or taking it all away. I mean, I think that should be our goal, rather than a victory over incumbents who maybe, because remember, all those billions you count out, Matthew, that's, if you're sitting on the board of one of these places, that's 150 days of cash, which is sort of a big management position. There's $1 trillion moving through these things. So it's anyway, don't get me started. But I think that's why with the new world order and the old world order have got to work together.
All right. So we are at the end of our time. I would normally do a go around, but I think we had a impassioned and fun time, and you know, I don't know. We'll save our go around for the start for the next couple. I want to thank my guests today. We have had on board. I'm trying to open up the lineup for you, but we have had on board Rosemarie Day from Day Health Strategies in Boston, Massachusetts. Kim Bellard from the wilds of the Midwest in Cincinnati. Robin Farmanfarmaian from Palo Alto, showing us her. She's been showing her earlier. She was showing, actually was literally doing infusion while this was going on, which is incredible multitasking. Deven McGraw, now from where are you? Somewhere in the wine country, Deven, in Northern California. Jeff Goldsmith from Virginia, Health Futurists Inc., and Ian Morrison from the wilds and craziness of Menlo Park. So that has been our show for today. I really want to thank all of you for coming aboard. I want to thank everyone for watching this. We'll be back same time, same place with the THCB Gang and other rotating cast of characters on, I believe it'll be January the 14th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. It's Matthew Holt, your host, signing off. Thanks for listening.